How's it going? How you doing, Marcia? Good. How are you? How are you? Yeah. I like your hat. It's very stylish.
Oh, thank you. It's a new one.
Is it? Christmas?
My sister-in-law gave it.
Nice. It's very hip.
Probably not.
We know what's hip.
When did Sam get his glasses?
Last week.
Oh, yeah, a couple weeks ago.
He's so cute. He's like such a little nerd.
I think he looks like Chicken Little. But he really wanted the green ones, and so I thought, well, if that's what's going to keep them on your face, green it is.
There you go.
And they weren't that bad looking, so.
He popped the lenses.
Yeah, he learned how to bring them on.
He's wearing his
He's like,
glasses,
I'm
but
gonna
the
wear
lenses
them.
were out. He's like, this is much better.
I noticed that I didn't see glare. I'm like, go like this. And he just like put it up to his eye. So I said, go like this. And I touched his finger.
It's what we call creative obedience.
There you go.
We
I gotta
didn't
wear my
say-
glasses.
We didn't say don't
Let's make them easy.
take them apart. We said wear.
When did you start wearing glasses?
I was in 4th grade.
But see, what they're trying to do.
Did they
is
hurt your
not
eyes at
like
first?
Lazy eyes.
No, I hate them really bad.
See, she said he's not a case like that, where it's like, oh, I'm great, well, I can see now. She said he could see, he had adapted.
Okay, yeah.
But what they're trying to do is engage the other eye in order for it to not lose the vision and then him become someone in need of the glasses. So we'll see. That's how she explained it. I don't know.
Wait, she wants him to become. She wants him to become a leader glasses.
This message from John 9 may turn into multiple week message, so that always encourages you to come back and get the rest of it. We'll see. There's just so much here that
It can't be multiple weeks, not preaching next week.
yeah, but there can be an intermission between the messages. But we'll see how we do. There's a lot of theology here. There's a lot to say about Christ, and it's a familiar story to you. But I want to read the entire chapter. Are you ready to go? John chapter 9, verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Evidently, you kind of get a mindset for how the disciples were operating from their teachers. They're basically thinking, sin must have caused this. This is the way God operates, that when people do bad stuff, he punishes them with diseases and sickness and things. And that was their mindset. And so they don't ask him, was it sin? They said, who sinned? That. In other words, their concept was God operates this way. When you're bad, he's going to do bad stuff to you. That's kind of the way they're operating. And that really tells you about the kind of fruit that is produced by the old covenant. And we're going to talk about that. But I just want to get you thinking about that here. Verse 3 says, but Jesus answered, it wasn't that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, because night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And having said these things, he spit on the ground. He made mud with his saliva. And then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and he washed and came back seeing. Now the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? And some said, yeah, it's him. And others said, no, he just looks like him. And he kept saying, no, it's me. I'm the man. That's me. So they said to him, then how were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. Now they said to him, where's this guy? Where's Jesus? He says, I don't know. Think about it. Jesus, and just to get this in your mind, Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud, puts it on his eyes, saying, now go wash somewhere else. And so he goes somewhere else. Well, Jesus doesn't go with him. He just sends him on his way. So this guy's never seen Jesus. He doesn't even know what Jesus looks like. Keep that in mind for later on when he meets Jesus face to face for the first time. Because you kind of wonder, how is it that you'll see in a minute. But keep that. He's never seen Jesus. And he says, so the man called Jesus made mud, anointed my eyes, said, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And so I went and washed, and I received my sight. And then he said to him, well, where is he? He says, I don't know. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Verse 14. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Underline that phrase. Important in this narrative. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this is an important phrase, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, well, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? He said, I think he's a prophet. I think he's from God. When he says he's a prophet, he's saying, I think he's from God. This man is from God. This man is a messenger from God. He's been sent from God. This is a man of God. Whether he knew who he was exactly or not, he understood him to be from God. And the Jews did not believe that he had been blind, and that he had received his sight. In other words, maybe they faked it. So until they didn't believe until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight, and they asked him, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" And his parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself." I like the commentary here John gives. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Now therefore, his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and he said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." I didn't understand that phrase at first as I was reading this. Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. In other words, who is the man testifying that healed him? He was testifying that Christ gave him the sight. In other words, the glory was going to Jesus. And they were saying, no, if you got your sight, we see that, but that man didn't do it. He's a sinner. God did it. Give glory to him. Just help you out with that phraseology there. I don't know. Anybody else stumble over that? Yeah. Verse 25, he answered, "Well, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. But one thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see." And they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again?" I love this guy's response. I like his sarcasm. It's very refreshing for me. Sarcasm is in the Bible. It's right here. He says, "Do you also want to become his disciples?" I like it. You gotta hear that, because the guy's like, "Dude, I can see. That's all I know. He put mud in my eyes. I can see. Why do you keep asking me this stuff? Do you want to be his disciples too?" I mean, that's the tone he's taking. That's the way I hear it in my mind. I don't just hear this weird, "and now the man said this," and I hear it in the way he did it. Anyway, let's keep going. Sorry. And he answered, "Whether he's a sinner, I don't know." Verse 25, "One thing I know, I was blind." Okay, I'm sorry, what was that? 28, there it is. "And they reviled him, saying, 'You are his disciples. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses.'" Very, very important line in this narrative. Underline that, circles that. Big deal. We know that God has spoken to Moses. We know that. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. And the man answered, I love this line. I love what he says. Why, this is an amazing thing. And let me say it now. You guys amaze me. Sarcastic language. You don't know where this guy's come from, and yet he opens my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it ever been heard that anyone's eyes were opened, and anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't do anything. And they answered him, you were born in utter sin, as if to say, we weren't born in sin, you were, and you would teach us? And they cast him out. Well, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? That line bothered me at first until I realized, wait a minute, this guy never saw Jesus. He didn't know who he was. Jesus just kind of comes up on the street like he's a stranger to him. Like, do you believe in the Son of Man after hearing, this? And he doesn't know this is Jesus. And Jesus says, you have seen him. And it is he who is speaking to you. And his immediate response is, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. And you would not have sin. That's the idea. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. Great story. A lot of theology here, a lot to say, a lot to speak of. We're going to start kind of going through it together. Let's pray. Father, this is a text that is glorious and wonderful, and I rejoice in the truths here. I pray that you would help make them clear and plain to those who are before me, that they may be encouraged and strengthened and lifted up because of your word. May we be encouraged by Jesus who loves us and who has freed us from the curse of the law. Amen. All right. So really, this text could be divided up into multiple sermons, and I'm just going to make it multiple points as we go through it. The first sermon, the first point that I would preach here is I would title it something like this: Jesus. It could be a couple of titles. It could be Jesus cares about you personally. You matter to him personally, or there is meaning. There is meaning in suffering. That would be the first thing that I see here. Because at the very beginning of the narrative, you have the disciples, and they're just passing by this beggar on the street, and he's blind, and they're curious because of their frame of mind. They're thinking, who sinned that this guy is like this? Why is this guy like this? It must be sin. It's either got to be his or his parents' sin. All in all, we know that nobody is really blind, or let's just add any kind of other sickness or lame or any other problem unless there's sin involved. And that gives you a picture of the way that the disciples were thinking about how God relates to man. Primarily, I'm guessing because they've been underneath the teaching and the tutelage of the Old Covenant, which that's the way the Old Covenant reads. Remember what God says through Moses. He says, today I pronounce to you blessings and I pronounce cursings to you. Blessings and cursings this day. Blessed if you do all the stuff that's in this law and you remember it all and you do it, you're blessed. And if you don't do it all, you're cursed. So if you do it, blessed. If you don't do it, cursed. And so they're operating on this principle that God blesses based upon sin or no sin. So that if you have a life free of malady, then, well, you're not a sinner. But the Pharisees obviously understood that this man was born in what? He was born in utter sin. And that's very evident by the fact that he's blind. And it seems to carry over. Now, I'm just reading between the lines here. I could be wrong on this, but it would seem to me that this is probably their mindset. that they're thinking, well, sin is the reason people have calamity. And I just want to tell you today, according to Jesus and his teaching, having any kind of sickness or pain or suffering that we go through isn't necessarily directly related to sin in our life. In fact, what Jesus teaches us here is a greater thing that sometimes we have a hard time wrapping our brains around. I have a hard time sharing with people who are suffering, because sometimes you feel like when people are suffering, when people are discouraged, are really broken over sadness or sickness that's over, they don't want to hear. Sometimes they I don't know, people want to be comforted by something other than hard truth. And people have a hard time with the idea that God allows or even does things like blindness and being lame and being sick so that he might be glorified. Look what this text teaches. It wasn't that, verse 3, it wasn't that this man sinned or his parents. In other words, sin wasn't the problem. If I could put some words in Jesus' mouth, Jesus says, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, God did this on purpose so that God might display his works. Now, how old was this guy? He's of age. I imagine he's an adult. I imagine he's probably 30 or 40 years old. Maybe 20 or 30. I don't know exactly. It doesn't tell us. I'm envisioning, a guy Andrew's age or something. Maybe my age. There again, life expectancy those years. I don't know how long people lived. And point is that this man was of age. He was a man, full-grown man, been blind all his life. I want you to think of the misery and the sorrow that this guy had to go through. I just want you to think about it for a minute. Okay, all the pain, all the difficulties, all the struggles that this guy had to go through his blindness. It was hard. It was tough. I imagine he had a life of difficulty. In fact, you look at it, what's he doing? He can't work for himself. The only thing he can do every day is to sit outside somewhere and beg. Maybe somebody will have pity on me. What a life. Maybe somebody will have pity on me and give me some money so I can live another day in this kind of helpless. I mean, I'm not trying to paint. I'm trying to paint a picture of reality here, what this guy might have been going through. And when Jesus says it wasn't because of his sin or his parents' sin, which makes human sense. Well, I mean, it would make total sense if God were to do that to the guy because he sinned or because his parents sinned, because that's justice. That's right. That's good. God's doing what the guy deserves. And I don't have a problem with that. But when you have a guy who hasn't done anything wrong necessarily to deserve such a thing, and then you say God did it, that becomes a difficulty in people's minds. I mean, it becomes very difficult, because when you say that God does calamity and he does it on purpose, people have a hard time with that. Now, if you say, listen, asteroids or meteors or fire from heaven came down and destroyed an entire city, two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And you look at that and you say, that's right. No problem. That should have happened, right? But then you look at like Joplin and the tornado that went through and killed all those people, or the tornadoes that killed the people, or hurricanes, or all the. You look at any other thing, and you look at these calamities, and you don't see the necessary connection with utter sin, and you're like, well, God didn't do that. God wasn't in control of that tornado. That was out of his hands. Then you've got a God who's not in control. You've got a God who doesn't know what he's doing. You've got a God who is not indeed sovereign at all. And I think people would say, no, Satan did that. Satan did that. Surely Satan can do those things. He can, can't he? And he does do these kinds of things. In fact, he did them to Job. But why did he do these things to Job? At the instruction of God. Satan said, read Job chapter 1. It's the instructions of God to go and do this. Now, that blows people's minds when I show it to them, because it really, you've got, let me just pause here, step outside the sermon. What I'm attempting to do here is teach this principle that we have to let the Bible tell us who God is. Let God tell us who he himself is, and not try to fit God into our comfortable boxes, but rather our boxes have to kind of always change and be important that God shapes his own box. Now, God is in a box. He is. He's in the box that he created. In other words, he will always be who he will always be. He never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So that is a box, isn't it? And he's definable, and yet we can't fully know all that he is defined by. So he is knowable, but not completely knowable until the day we see him face to face. Then we'll know all that he is. And God was revealing all that he was in Jesus. So he is knowable. But he's knowable based upon who he is, not based upon who we want him to be. Now, these are hard things. For me, these truths aren't hard necessarily because these are the things, this is the way Christy and I relate to difficulty in our life. I remember, when she was a young Christian and we were talking about cancer, and she says, well, if I ever get cancer, it'll be God's cancer. I just never forget she said that. And she was a young believer at the time, but she understood the sovereignty of God. And for me, it's a comfort to say God's in control and he knows what he's doing and he loves me more than anything. So my pain, my cancer, my difficulty, your hurt neck and it, not things not going well at First Baptist and any other thing, just relating to things that go on in your life, things that aren't going well. For me, it's a comfort to say, well, God has purpose in that. He has meaning in that. And ultimately, look what he says. So that the works of God might be displayed. So that God might display his glory. One of the most comforting truths in all the Bible for me is that God deserves glory. And he's willing to get his glory through me. And so what we say then, sin isn't necessarily the result, what brings calamity in our life, but a God who has chosen vessels, you and me, to get glory for himself. I want to point that to the fact that God didn't choose the Pharisees in this story to get glory. He came to bring them judgment. But yet this guy who has been blind all his life, going through pain, God isn't looking at that pain and saying, no, that's worthless, that's meaningless, that'll do nothing. God is saying, that pain, that sorrow is temporary. I think one of the reasons why we go through calamity, why we are waiting so long and why God lets us remain. Why doesn't God just stop the suffering right now and just, come on, I'm waiting for it. Aren't you waiting for it? Why doesn't he just stop the pain, sorrow, not another death, not another sorrowful accident, not another piece of anything that would bring sorrow in this world? Why doesn't he stop it now? Paul gives us the answer in Romans 8. He says, I consider the sufferings of this present time not even worth comparing to the glories that will be revealed. The illustration I always give is, if you spent your entire life in a mansion and someone comes to you and says, hey, come, live in my mansion. And you go and you live in their mansion and you're like, okay, this is what I'm used to living in. It's not that great. It's not that glorious. But what about a kid who's been living in the slums? What about a kid who all his life is at nothing? And the day he moves into that mansion, it'll be a glorious, glorious thing, right? Why? Because living in the slums shows him what little he has, but when he gets it all, it's glorious indeed. We folks are living in the slums of earth. But there's one day we'll be residents of a new earth. It'll be glorious and wonderful. And God is working all these things out for that glorious day. And this is one of the ways we make sense of pain and sorrow. So I would say to you, one aspect of this is there's meaning in suffering. It's not meaningless. It has meaning. And ultimately, I think John Piper hits the nail on the head. The way we should respond to that is don't waste it. Don't waste it. A guy in a Facebook group, a theology group of mine, announced today that the elders of his church are letting him go. They're firing him. I don't exactly know what he does at the church, but he was pretty bummed. And and I don't know any of the details other than he's living for Jesus and he's now about to lose his job. You know, it's a hard thing to go through. And I just said to him, I know what that feels like. I know that pain. But we've got a God who's a fully dependable provider. And I'm sure in the coming days you're going to feel that and see that. But what I can also say to him is, there's meaning in that. Even if we don't understand it now, there's meaning. There's purpose. God has a really, really good way of doing things on his own that he doesn't really need us for. If we say that we are the vessels and he is the one wielding the vessel, who's the one that's responsible for doing the work? God himself. You're just the vessel. May it comfort you to know that in any pain, in any sorrow, in any suffering, you have a God who knows, who sees, who is telling to you this is temporary. Hang in there. There's glories that will be revealed. My Father is going to be glorified in you. May that comfort you as you bear it. God was willing to let this man grow up an entire life without seeing, so that the day he saw, he could bring glory to Jesus. They said, glorify God, and he was. The second piece is, it wasn't like this guy, they happened upon this guy, I don't think. It says, and as they passed by. Jesus makes it clear that this wasn't just a random passerby. This wasn't here's a blind guy. This guy had a purpose from his birth. And now he's coming to the day that he was made for. That's a big deal. One day out of his entire life. That's why God made it, primarily. I mean, there's other ways he can bring glory to God. But let me say, too, that one of the things that encouraged me from this is, you know what? There might be one moment in your life that you were made for, as far as God's ultimate plan to bring about major glory for himself. Now, all of your life has meaning. But just because you don't see and understand, you can't make sense of what you're to do in your life or how things are going, realize that God knows what he's doing with your life. And he can direct it and move it, and he's good at it. And he is not going to miss the day. And you're not going to miss it. He's got glory planned for your life because he made all things for his glory. Isaiah 43:7 says, everyone who is called by my name, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and I made. You get a picture of God forming and making you individually. Isaiah 43:7. God formed you on purpose. The way you look, the way you think, the way you laugh, and the way you talk, and the way that you live your life. He formed you on purpose so that you might bring him glory. Your life has great meaning in that. That gives me great joy. It gives me great encouragement. How do you respond to that? How does that hit you on the head?
So you hit on something that has occurred to me over and over. We get accustomed to our, you might say, mundane Christian life because we do the same thing, always looking for something, how God leading. But we don't know for the 5 minutes one day that we've made a world of difference in someone else's life. You just don't know.
They never know.
Yeah.
Point being, he quoted that conversation. I was just saying what I thought. I mean, I remember having the conversation, but I didn't remember that it impacted him. It just came and went. But I've just in recent years heard him refer to it. I meant what I said, but I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I just thought I was telling him what was inside of my head. But a thought that I had when you were talking about how God makes people and how there are other, biblical examples of where people, they're caught up in a theology like that, oh, well, you've done wrong if these things happen. But there's plenty of other verses to talk about. I mean, they just leap off the page. God purposed that. God did that. And I think what happens with us as humans is we get caught up in being arrogant about how our lives ought to be, and our definition of good, and our definition of just. And we decide that if God doesn't act in according to those definitions, then therefore, there's some disjunct somewhere, some misfire, and whether it be because we did something wrong or whatever, now all of a sudden, we're questioning him, when really it all boils down to the fact that he's God. He is the creator. If he wanted to do everything in just a negative, awful, rotten way, that's his prerogative. And we have to be okay with that. But the good news is that's not how he does things. He has a purpose and a plan in mind that is so far more, greater reaching than we can even conceive of. Yet we get miffed because he decided for someone to go home sooner than we wanted them to, or whatever. And I'm not trying to downplay any emotions or feelings that might come from that, but ultimately it's got to rise and fall on him and his purposes. What am I going to say about it? And that's what Job said. What did God? God said to Job, actually. What are you going to say about it?
That
I'm God.
that thought brings
People.
that thought brings me out of depression more. I struggle off and on with depression, and usually the thought that brings me out is, well, wait a minute, what am I depressed about? God, you can do whatever you want. And for me, that brings me out of it. When I'm submitting to the one who's in control, I'm basically saying, God, what am I? Because in my depression, it's usually complaining. I'm sad because things aren't going my way. My life isn't turning out the way I planned it to be, or whatever. Things aren't going exactly how I want them to go. And basically, when I come to the realization that, wait a minute, God can do whatever he wants to do because he's God and I don't deserve a thing, yet he's gracious and good and loving in all that he does. But it brings me out, brings me to a mindset of, God, you're in control. And I usually follow it, so do whatever you want. Do whatever you want. And that helps me to actually rest and not be frazzled about this or that going on in my life.
I won't actually invite with that implication, but I say you will do what you want, and I will rest in you as you do what you want. So proceed. I'm not to that place yet.
You're playing with the words there. I do that too. I play with the words. How many words is carefully, God?
Yeah, it really matters how you word it.
Yeah, right. Because I know you can't see what's really in the heart at all. Let me word this really, really carefully.
Another, biblical example of what we're talking about is Joseph. Thinking about, he goes through all this hardship, and at the end of the day, his brothers are like, we're really sorry for what we did, but Joseph already understands, hey, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, and it's just not true that the bad things in life are punishment from God necessarily or whatever. In fact, it's often the hard things that God most uses for his glory. I can think of hard times in my life, and those have been the times when God has most grown me in him, or gotten most glory out of me. And it's kind of a silly illustration, but think about you watch two musicians play. One of them plays a song on a clarinet, and he plays great. The other one plays on a carrot, and he plays great. Which one are you going to be more impressed with? Have you seen the videos where they make the instruments out of the carrots? But God's instrument often is things that we would be like, ain't no way you can use that.
Or another way, the same illustration just is, you hear a guy play an instrument beautifully, and then you hear another person play an instrument because he has no arms or only has feet or something. He plays the same instrument even beautifully with a handicap or something like
Right.
that. It becomes more glorious.
Yeah, God's like, oh yeah, I mean you could do something pretty good with a nice life, but watch this. I'm gonna take this guy, that guy, and I'm gonna get glory out of him, and that's how he does it. He gets glory out of hard circumstances, and it's all the more glorious because he uses it, and it's great.
Maybe, some of the hardship comes when that glory is obscure. We're not necessarily seeing it result. I read a meme this week. I don't know who it was. It seems like it was something Piper said. God is up to, however, this astronomical number of things, and you're probably aware of 3. And so just because we don't see the end of a thing, doesn't mean that God hasn't executed his plan and his purpose and it's not been good. Or
I keep making me think of things, but you remember that I mentioned a couple weeks ago the children's book, the three trees. It talks about basically the 3 trees. One became the boat that Jesus stood and preached in. One became the manger that he was born in. One became the cross. It's the idea that actually, think about it, God actually created wood for those purposes. All things are made with purpose and meaning.
and the tree had to be cut down.
I don't want to get too deep into that
Whittle
theological.
away.
I thought about that before, like eating a piece of fruit, and who knows, it's from California or Mexico. I'm just thinking, when this grew on the tree, like in a different country, God knew I was going to eat this fruit.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, stuff
Yeah.
like that. I don't know.
No, absolutely.
But God, it's also neat, I think, when God tells us or tries to prepare us, he says, don't be troubled when you have difficult circumstances because there's this purpose, and goes through the characteristics that he wants to develop in us. And I think that helps me come out of depression or a quandary, what is God doing?
Mhm.
He says, well, there's a purpose for it. It's probably the stuff that I want to do. It's neat that he tells us that. We don't have to be.
He doesn't always tell us the purpose. He
No.
doesn't. So one of the
Well, he
things.
does in the extent that he develops character
Mhm.
and then also to give him glory. So he does
Yeah.
tell us why.
Right, but specific purposes or things. And that's what I was getting ready to say, basically. So we go to these general principles and say, okay, he doesn't always tell us exactly why things happen, but here's what we can know. God does have purpose in it, and he is going to get glory out of it because he knows how to bring glory from those. He made you for his glory. So,
And you develop the patience and endurance. This is godlike character that he's producing that doesn't come from this day-to-day thing that looks plain and without event.
well, there's a second piece to this as we move on to the next portion of the text, verse 6 and on. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and he made mud with his saliva and he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. Find that to be an interesting connection there. So he went and he washed. And he came back seeing. And evidently Jesus is gone by now. And the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar, is this not the man who sit and beg? It is. Some said, yeah, it's him. And others said, no, it just looks like him. And he kept saying, no, it's me. And they said to him, then how are your eyes open? And the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and I washed and received my sight. They said to him, well, where is it? He said, I don't know. And they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had formerly been blind. So this is the point in the narrative where John makes it clear to say, now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes. Now, evidently, it was against the law to spit on the ground on the Sabbath, because you might be watering a plant or doing something. I mean, they would basically, he spit, and that water might go to nourish some grass or a plant. Evidently, that's what some believe the historical problem with what Jesus was doing was that he spit on the ground, and thus was doing work by watering the ground. Now,
That's good. Sorry. Can I just say that out loud?
Dave's not here to appreciate it.
I was thinking the same thing.
You don't find them very funny, do you? It was the Sabbath when Jesus made mud and opened his eyes. Also, the work of doing the healing also brought into question. So the Pharisees asked again how he received his sight. Let's get this straight. He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. The Pharisee said, this isn't from God because he doesn't keep Sabbath. Right there, we need to stop and think. What was in the mind of the Pharisees? How do you determine if a person is from God? And their answer would be, he keeps the law of Moses. That's what their answer would be. They make it very clear. What verse was it? Where they mentioned they follow Moses. 28, thank you. He says, they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We follow and do what Moses told us to do. And what we need to begin seeing here, or not begin, you already had some background in it as I've taught it from other places, but what you have to understand here is that Jesus is coming, and he is indeed not following Moses per se. And the answer is he is coming. Jesus is not coming to establish and to confirm this covenant that God made with Moses and the people of Israel when he brought them out of Egypt. He's not coming to confirm and establish it as ongoing, but rather he's coming to fulfill it and put it to an end. And Jesus is already operating as if it's being put to the end. He is, in Matthew chapter 12, he's called the Lord of the Sabbath. And let's go there to begin to see some of this theology playing out here. So let's go to Matthew chapter 11. What I want you to see here is that the Sabbath in particular is a big deal for the Pharisees. That's one of the reasons why they tried to nail Jesus on. Look, this guy heals on the Sabbath. This guy, they were eating, they were going through a cornfield or something. They were going through a field and they picked grains and they were eating. And you couldn't do that on the Sabbath day. And nor did they wash their hands. And the Pharisees would just try to nail Jesus and his disciples on the fact that he didn't keep the Sabbath the way they kept it. That is very true. Let's go to chapter, I said to 12, didn't I? Let's go back to chapter 11. I want you to see something there first. Verse 20. Matthew 11, verse 20. Then he began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done because they didn't repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. And at that time Jesus declared, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. Underline that and think on that for a while. Verse 27. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Verse 28. So come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you what? Rest. Take my yoke upon you. In other words, yoke with me. Join up with me. Enter into my yoke. A yoke is this wooden thing that ties two animals together so that they can work alongside each other. So Jesus is envisioning himself wearing a yoke, and there's an empty spot for you. Yoke up with him. Take his yoke upon him. Now don't take it away from him. Join Christ. Link up with him. Join him is the idea. And learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest. I'm here to give you rest. Rest for your souls. Because my yoke is easy. My burden is light. And at that time, after saying this, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And indeed, if you go back and read in the Old Covenant, it was not lawful for them to do what they were doing. And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" In other words, the priests, by their very job, do that which the Sabbath commands them not to do, and they're guiltless. They're allowed to do that. It's okay. That's what he's saying. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. What is Jesus saying here? Jesus is saying, number one, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm greater than David. I'm greater than the priests in the Old Covenant. I'm greater than Moses because I'm totally and completely doing that which they said you can't do. Why? Because I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. In the previous text, he declares that he is the one you come to receive rest. You want real rest? Sabbath is just a picture of rest, but you don't get full and complete rest. You get a weekly rest that is not really like rest. It's more like labor because I can't do that which I want to do. I can't do those things. I can't travel too far. I can't eat too much food. I can't do too much. It's really the Sabbath, the way that the Pharisees laid it on the people was much more of a burden. A day designed to bring rest and worship was a day that was more work than it was not. And Jesus was like, do you want real rest? Come to me. In other words, don't go to the Pharisees. They won't give you rest. They'll lay burdens on you too heavy to bear that they don't even bear themselves. He says in other chapters. No, you come to me. I give rest. Now, how does he have the authority to do that? Because the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. You see, the Sabbath wasn't made, man wasn't made for the Sabbath, Jesus says in another place. The Sabbath was made for man. Jesus is teaching a principle. The Sabbath, which was I can't remember the text now, it's in Deuteronomy. God made the Sabbath the sign of the Old Covenant. It was the sign of the Old Covenant. That if you broke the Sabbath, you broke the entire covenant. Now, if you broke the covenant, you were to be condemned, put to death. You were to be shunned and put out. It was a place, and if you're outside of the covenant of God's grace and of God's mercy, then you're in a place of cursing, not blessing, right? So the Sabbath was a sign of the covenant. That's why for Jesus to do that which the Old Covenant says you can't do, it was a big deal for the Pharisees. Why? Because they're still living under the curse of the law. They're still living under that covenant. Now, back in our text in John chapter 9, what you see here is that Jesus is again challenging this Sabbath day. He's challenging Moses as the authoritative lawgiver. And he's basically saying, I'm greater than Moses. In fact, he says that in another place. A greater than Moses is here. A greater than Abraham is here. Oh, for the Pharisees to hear that, that was blasphemy. Because only God is greater than those things. But when you tell the truth, it's not blasphemy at all. You see, what was going on is that the Pharisees were disciples of Moses. But if they had been true disciples of Moses, they should have known there was one coming that was going to inaugurate a new covenant. And in there being a new covenant, that puts the old covenant to be obsolete. Now the Pharisees are living under this old covenant. They are bound by it, and they are in their mind cursed by it. They don't feel cursed by it. They feel justified by it. They don't even realize that they were indeed cursed by it because they haven't kept the law. No one does good, not one. But in their minds, they were doing the covenant. They were living under the covenant, and they were not sinners. Others were. He said to this man in John 9, you were born in utter sin. There's an implication behind those words. You were born in utter sin. We're keepers of the covenant. We follow Moses. But had they read Moses, they would have known that Moses and Abraham alike rejoiced to see the day Jesus showed up. They rejoiced to see that day. And so Jesus is now inaugurating, as he comes, he's inaugurating the kingdom, which has a new covenant and a new lawgiver, namely Jesus. What of the Sabbath? Well, the Sabbath in the Old Covenant was a shadow, a picture. And it was rooted in creation. God said, I'm establishing a Sabbath with you. For God worked 6 days and he stopped working on the 7th. Did he start working again on the 8th? No. Now, is God working now? Is God doing stuff now? Yeah, he's doing stuff. So in what sense does God stop working? He stopped doing one work. What's he stopped doing? He stopped doing creation work. He created for 6 days, and he finished the creation work, and he says it's good. It's right. He did the creating, and he declared it to be good. Now, do you see that? That's an important language. He did the creating, and he said it's good. And when he said it's good, there's no way to improve upon it. So, in other words, when God finished, there was no way to make it better. Lest he would have kept doing it, because the way God does it, he does everything good. He does everything right. So when God does his work and he finishes it, there's nothing we could add to it. There's nothing we could take away. It is good. And so God entered into an eternal rest where there's no more work in creating work. There's no more doing any creation work. So the Sabbath, here's the deal. The Sabbath was rooted in that pattern, that picture. God worked for 6 days and he stopped on the 7th. So God said, in this old covenant, you're going to remember that. You're going to work 6 days, and on the Sabbath, you're not. And if you break that Sabbath, you're cut off from the covenant. So this was a big deal. In other words, they were to commemorate the creation work finished by God that he was completely satisfied with, commemorate that weekly. And it was also evident within the terms of that Sabbath. They would basically, it was designed to be a covenant that said, if you don't stop working, I won't be pleased with you. In other words, the only way to please me is to stop working and to rest in my finished work. That's what the Sabbath was. Well, evidently the Pharisees are still holding on to that. But Jesus is now coming and saying, no. I will give you true rest, real rest. Joshua, he led you to the promised land, but he didn't give you rest. The author of Hebrews says the rest wasn't provided by Joshua. There's another day because David came a long time after Joshua and says, today there's a rest waiting for you. There's a rest waiting for you. And he was pointing to Christ. Christ then, being the Lord of the Sabbath, is the Sabbath rest for the believer. Now think of it. In the new covenant, it's the fulfillment of the old. So you got the old covenant Sabbath is the shadow, is the picture of what God is providing in the new covenant. Well, what is God providing in the new covenant? Well, think about What's the work that Jesus is doing on the cross? He's doing new creation work. He's doing a creating work. But it's a new creation that he's making. He's not creating an earth and people. He's doing a work of new creation, creating sons and daughters for his namesake. And what did he say on the cross? It's done. If Jesus did it all, how much is left to be done? Not 1 ounce of work. And so in this new covenant, we enter into a Sabbath rest by resting in the finished work of Jesus on the cross. When he completed the work, I find nothing to add to what Jesus has done. And I can take nothing away, but simply I rest in his finished work on my behalf. And he has made indeed a new creature. That is the ultimate Sabbath rest that is provided by Jesus in his work on the cross. And so how do we enter into that rest? When we believe that Jesus was enough, we no longer work for God's favor. We no longer strive in all of our effort to try to please God so that he will love us a little bit more. We no longer strive to gain or hold on to Christ's love by anything that we do. We always point to the work of Jesus. We always hold on to the work of Jesus to say what he has done is enough. That's what entering into rest means. It's a complete ceasing from any and all labor that you would try to strive for to gain and grab on to God's love by. You'll never get it that way. And in the new covenant, you will never please God unless you stop working. You have to realize that God is only pleased with his work, and you can't make it any better than what he's done. And so by faith we say, Christ, you are my all. You are what I hope for. You are my one glory and honor. You are what I place my trust in. And that's what the true Sabbath rest is all about. They were holding on to Moses. We follow Moses. This man was following Christ. And he saw the temporary deficiency. He saw the deficiencies of following Moses. It only brought his condemnation. But what liberty there was when he followed Jesus. He got sight. I don't know anything, but here's what I know. I was blind, but now I see. And Jesus says, that's what I've come to take blind people and give them sight. I've come to take lame people and make them well. I've come to take, and that's just imagery for, I've come to take sinners and remove their sin. I have come to take their infirmities away from them. When Isaiah speaks of a man who will come and take away the infirmities of people, he's not talking about miracles, though Jesus did those things. They're always in reference to what he's done in the soul of a man. Because Jesus says, follow me and I'll give you rest for what? Your soul. Your soul. What you must see then. We are inheritors of this glorious new covenant in which we can have no condemnation and there's no work left to be done but to rest in Jesus' finished work. That is gloriously relieving. Imagine living under the old covenant, where the preacher would stand up and say, if you don't do these things, you'll be cast out, destroyed, stoned, or all these other things. And you would be preached condemnation to week after week. You would be looked down upon by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who loved the honor of men, who thought that they were so much more righteous than all you sinners. But in this glorious new covenant, I stand with you on equal grounds, a sinner saved by grace. All I know is I was a sinner, but Christ took my sins away and gave me eyes to see. That's my testimony. It's a story, we sang it, it's a story of him. And that is your story, if you know Christ. And this real life narrative is really just a picture of the salvation work of Jesus and the glorious joys of the new covenant. They said to him, verse 34, you were born in utter sin. Would you teach us? And they cast him out. Here you see a man who shed everything he had been taught to embrace Christ. Hebrews 13 says, in the old covenant, they would take the carcasses of the animals that were killed, they would take the carcasses, and they would take them outside of the camp, away from the camp. They were cast out and excluded as trash, and they were. And they were burned and discarded outside the camp. The author of Hebrews says that's a picture of Jesus. Jesus being that sacrifice that actually took sins away, yet he was rejected and despised by this, within the bounds of this camp of the Old Covenant. And he was put outside and burned, killed on the cross. And the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 13 says, let us therefore go outside the camp and join Jesus in his sufferings. And that's what this man had to do. He had to say, I'm throwing off that old covenant that kills and I'm embracing Christ. That's what he did. They recognized he was following Jesus. He says, we follow Moses. Oh, let us not try to bring Moses into our new covenant. Don't try to bring law into our covenant. Don't even operate that way in any shape or form, thinking that, man, I've had a rotten day. Look at how rotten I was. I better get this stuff straight in my life so God will love me a little bit more today. Or God will be able to forgive me. Don't try to bring that into the new covenant, because the new covenant has nothing to do with your work. It has everything to do with His work. Because in the new covenant, it's all by promise, not by earn. And the question is, will you receive that promised covenant blessing? How do you receive it? You simply take God at His word. He's the one who said it. Are you going to take God at His word? There's nothing to be done but what my Son has done. It is finished. So let us join Christ outside the camp. Don't try to bring law into this camp. There's only one law in this camp. And that's the law of love. The love that God Himself places on your heart. Love. But don't think when that unloving spirit shows itself that you've somehow annulled yourself of being a part of the blessing of the covenant. God didn't give the blessing of the covenant to good people. He gave them to bad people. And He made them competent to be ministers. He makes us competent to be ministers of a new covenant. So don't think by your lack of effort, by your lack of fulfilling some measurement, some mark of spirituality that you've set for yourself. Don't think because you've missed some mark that you're something lower in this covenant. Because in this covenant, everyone in the covenant knows Christ personally and is exalted by Christ personally. And there is no first in this covenant, and there is no last. There's no greatest in the kingdom, as if Paul and the apostles are going to be up on the pedestal and we're all going to be like, man, I wish I could go talk to them. They are sinners saved by grace, and that is our testimony as well. Jesus tells a story to that effect. He says the kingdom of God's like this. A guy goes and hires some people at the first hour of the day, and he says, I'll pay you a day's wage. Come and work. He goes out the third hour of the day. He says, man, I still need some more workers. And he says, hey, I'll pay you what's fair. Come work for me. He goes in the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and the 11th hour, gets more workers. And at the end of the day, what does everybody get? At the end of the day, the same wage. Why? Because we have a generous master who delights in giving his children the kingdom. So may this be a year where you just begin to embrace the blessings of the new covenant. And I'm purposing to make these truths even more glorious to you. That you have a God who loves you. And it is a steadfast love. And I've got some good news. It has nothing to do with you. But a God who is willing to die so that He might make you lovable and be lovable. And that is a sure and glorious covenant that is made. So much more we could say from this text. I might read it again this week and come up with a third sermon from here. It's such a good text. I could say some more things, but I should stop. What say you guys? Questions?
I just thought about talking about the creation and when it was over, God said it was good, and he turned
I forgot to make that point. Make it, please.
over, I don't know that I'm making the point
You
you
won't- well,
wanted to
okay,
make,
go
but, we'll see. I was just thinking how he turned it over to man to perpetuate, you know, life, his offspring, and once man took handle on the reins, corruption flourished.
That's not the point.
I didn't think so, that's why I said that. I just felt like it no longer appeared to be good, yet God set it into motion. And the point is that as I look at that and what we did to what God started, that was a good thing. You know, it's the same thing with how God just said, you know how people say, well, if you want something done right, you just gotta go do it yourself. So he just basically came on down here and did what we've already proven time and time again we cannot do. And he made restoration possible, and he perfected.
And when God finished his work, this is the point I was going to make, is when he created a new creature, what does he say of us? It's good. Except he uses more glorious words. Holy, blameless, above reproach, who will stand before him in utter confidence.
And we are the same people on a day that we believe it was a good day as we are standing before him on a day that was a bad day. And I think that that's where we have to get our brains in check, because there's no merit in having a good day. Should we strive to have a good day? Yes. But it doesn't improve our situation, because the situation is the best it could ever be because God did it, not us.
When we have done that which was commanded of us, we should just say we are unworthy servants, doing only what should have been done. Luke 17, I think.
Regardless of whether we work the whole day or 1 hour at the end of the day.
I saw another point where you were saying that you connected creation with recreation. So like God, and what Pearce was saying, so like God creates everything and then he says, okay, it's finished. I'm gonna stop working. Okay, Adam, now you go, and I'm sending you out to do all this. And so like Jesus died on the cross and he said, it is finished. And now he said, now I'm sending you.
That's good.
Like, but we have the Spirit now, so
That's the point I made. Yes.
we
very
don't.
good.
We do good instead of before when he sent out Adam and Eve, then they did.
Excellent. Good connection. I didn't make that connection. That's good. That's right. You have to watch. One of the things I wanted you to get out of this, just to tell you, is I want you to be careful that you don't accidentally or inadvertently bring law into the glorious nature of the new covenant. I've done it for years. And when God freed me from that, I've been utterly free from that. But it still comes into my mindsets on occasion, and I have to watch it creeping back in. Because there are days when I'm not feeling loved by God much. And the fact is that I'm no more lovable on the day, like my wife said, no more lovable the days I feel lovable. I'm not any more lovable because of my deeds. I have to, on my best day, discipline myself to say, but for Christ. That way, on my worst day, I could say, but for Christ. Both days, best and worst. Christ is the worker. And we are just the recipients of glorious promises that we can't even begin to imagine.
On those days that we feel good about, we're deluded because seriously, because one of the things that God wants from us is our wholehearted love and adoration toward him. And I can't say that I can go 5 minutes and even come close to what that's supposed to be. So how can I, just because I go through some motions that seem more honoring to him than my actions, can I say that I've really wholly devoted myself to him in the way that he deserves and it's his due? I've never at any one time done that. Never. So that's what I use to level the playing field when I think, oh, well, not pretty bad today. Bad every day for that reason, but for Christ.
Father, thanks for the word. Thank you for John. Thank you for this man who was blind and now sees. Lord, thank you for this covenant that you allowed us to enter in. You brought the Gentiles into. Lord, we just rejoice in the glorious nature of Jesus and what he's done. I pray, God, that you would indeed continue to just impress that word upon our hearts, that we might live out the righteousness that you've called us to, but to rest in your yoke, your easy yoke. We love you, Jesus. Amen. Who let the dogs out?